Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to PB at Noon. I'm Paul Benwell, and I'm joined by my colleague, Sophie Caesar. We're very excited to introduce you to Algernon Pharmaceuticals. Algernon trades on the CSE under the symbol AGN. They are a clinical stage drug development company focused on the disease areas of stroke, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and chronic cough, as well as COVID-19. The company and its business model is highly capital efficient and strives to deliver maximum shareholder value. Their unique approach to drug discovery is based on the concept of drug repurposing. They recently announced they would begin manufacturing of the drug Respirinast, which helps treat asthma, and they are launching a new chorionic kidney disease research program. Here to explain all of this is the CEO, Chris Moreau. Chris, start whenever you wish, and we'll have some questions for you at the end. Thanks so much.
Okay, Paul, nice seeing you again, and thank you everybody for joining. I'm going to, I've been told I only have 20 minutes, so that's absolutely horrible since I could talk to you for about 3 hours, but I'm going to condense this. So for those of you new to Algernon, we are a clinical stage drug development company. What's very unique about Algernon is that we are not advancing new drugs from the laboratory through to clinical approval. That's a very different business model. It's a very expensive business model, and it's a very high-risk business model. When it works, but we're talking about a 13-year process that costs in the hundreds of millions, and the risks of failure in the early stages are very significant. And so drug repurposing is not new, but Algernon's approach is, and repurposing is simply trying to find a new use for an older, safer drug. Drugs have what's known as a polypharma effect in the body. As the general public, we have a rash or a sore back, we get a prescription and we take the pill and we hope it works. But medications are doing other things in our bodies. They can often be interacting with different mechanisms and different targets. And it's been found in the past that sometimes a drug that was initially developed to treat disease A could also treat disease B. And what's the most efficient way to find out if that works? If it works, you could have a blockbuster drug on your hands. So we're talking about blockbuster means billion-dollar markets, and it's been done a number of times very successfully. So the value of repurposing is that it's much more, it's a faster pathway to market. It's highly capital efficient. The challenge is to find a drug that has not been widely marketed. If it's widely marketed, because of generic competition, it's very difficult to have a business model that makes sense. So our unique approach is that we have been focused on investigating drugs that have never been approved in the US or Europe. And so if we bring a new drug in for a new disease, we'll be first there and best dressed in the market. Just quickly, I want to help elucidate, to shine some light on what is the typical pathway for a new drug. You have the preclinical stage. This takes about 3 to 5 years. The drug never leaves the lab. You're testing it on human cells. You're testing it on animal cells. You're testing it in animals. You're manufacturing the drug. You're doing toxicity. Only 10% make it out of the preclinical phase. That's an astounding number if you think about it. Costs could range from 15 to 20 million to 200 or 300 million. It depends who's doing the work. Then if you're lucky enough to get your drug into a phase 1 study, that's really safety. And as a study, it's 20 to 50 people, safety and dosing. You're not treating people who have the disease yet. You're just giving it to healthy people. And you can still see a significant failure rate, 34%. This is the first time you're testing your drugs in human, your drug in human beings. As you move on into a phase 2 is the first time you get to test your drug in the patient population that you're trying to treat. And this is the biggest moment for a small company like Algernon. If you have a success, and it's 50-50, that's the greatest moment of inflection. Now, if you have a successful phase 3, you're obviously going to have growth with your stock and value creation. But the change from a phase 2 early to phase 2 data, that's the greatest moment. One other point I'd like to make, this shows 50-50, a failure rate to success to get it out of your phase 2 into phase 3. Note the percentage of failure for safety reasons. So even though you have a new drug, you've tested it in the clinic, you even done a phase 1, there's no guarantee that your drug won't be found to cause problems in the patient population you're treating. And somebody might say, well, how can that be? You've done all this early work. This is really the first time you're treating people ostensibly for a longer period of time as well. They have the disease you're going after. Failure can happen due to safety. If you repurpose a drug, you reduce the risk, theoretically, of having a safety failure in phase 2. So you find a drug that's been around for a while, it's off patent. You think because of its target or mechanism, it could treat another disease, hydrochloroquine, remdesivir. Because of COVID, we all have a better understanding of what repurposing a drug means. And you can get that drug very quickly into a phase 2 trial because all of the work has been already done in the preclinical and phase 1 years ago. So it's a very interesting model. Take an old drug, see if it might treat something else, get it into a phase 2 trial where it's a 50-50 win. And if it's successful, create a massive value creation for the company. One other thing I want to say about the Algernon model, because we can do this in the range of 3 to 4 million per drug, our view was to always have more than one drug and more than one disease going on at the same time, multiple horses in the race, so that if we're successful, just one of our drugs needs to have a good phase 2 result, and then everybody will benefit. So quickly moving on, I want to give you 2 examples of successful repurposing plays. And then I'll lightly talk about, just because of our limited time, the lead drugs and the lead indications we're working on. So post-World War II, Germany, there was a drug that was developed to treat psoriasis. It had a limited market, only sold in Germany. People who were taking the drug who actually had MS over the years would come back to their doctor and say, you know what, that's a fantastic drug, and my MS symptoms are getting better. Happened enough times. The scientists ran the drug in an animal study of MS. That's what you do. Will it work in an animal first? They saw some data. They filed new intellectual property. That's what Algernon does as well. Method of use patents, dosing, formulation. There are ways to try to, and in fact, you must have some intellectual property around your new drug to justify investment to help drive your program forward. Anyway, long story short, it was approved for MS, became a $1 billion drug for Biogen. Second example, Celgene. For those of us that are old enough to know, thalidomide was a drug in the late 50s and early 60s to help treat morning sickness for pregnant women. Sadly, it caused horrific birth defects. Thalidomide babies were born, fetuses had their limbs weren't fully formed. And as it turns out, the drug at a cellular level interrupts blood supply. And so once it was off the market in the 60s, scientists started looking at it again for solid tumors. And that makes sense because if you can starve out a tumor's blood supply, you can have a dramatic effect, not only on arresting its growth, but you might also be able to have remission. This is a $1 billion program for Celgene. 2 repurposed drug examples. Algernon is following the very same path. So we won't have time to go into too much detail on all of them, but we are working in 3 different areas. We're working in inflammatory disorders with our lead drug, ifenprodil. It's a Japanese drug, actually, from Sanofi, and we're running a phase 2 trial for a disease of the lung and chronic cough. That data is expected in June. We've recently announced a new chronic kidney disease program for Respirinast. Paul did pretty good with pronouncing some of these strange words. Respirinast is a Mitsubishi drug used to treat asthma. So interesting, different backgrounds. And our science team has looked at those drugs and said, you know what? I think the targets and mechanism might help those drugs treat other diseases. In the cerebrovascular area, we are investigating a psychedelic drug called DMT for stroke. Excited to talk to you about why. And hopefully we'll have time. I'll touch on it briefly. We're also looking at expanding our examination of ifenprotal for pancreatic and small cell lung cancer. So this tells you, this is really a good page. All in once, you can see we are a phase 2 company. We have we have an IPF and cough study going on. We have other compounds in preclinical, although they're older, safer drugs. We have a little work to do, but we're going to move them into phase 1s and phase 2s. So let's talk a bit about our lead program for stroke. Most people rather, may not know that the vast majority of stroke patients, about 80%, are going to end up in a hospital bed without a treatment. And that's sad to say that after hundreds of drugs have been tried, all pretty well have failed, except maybe blood thinners. And just to explain quickly, there are 2 types of strokes. One is an ischemic, which is a block. The other is hemorrhagic, a bleed in the brain. 85% are ischemic, so some form of a blockage. And really the only treatment they have is twofold: to give you a blood thinner, which will help try to dissolve that clot, restore blood flow, or they'll go in through a small catheter tube into the brain where your clot is, and they try to mechanically remove it. Only about 10 to 15% of people will be eligible for that. The other 80 to 85%, they're simply kept stable, and there's hope and prayer that the stroke hasn't damaged you too much. So this is a very important area. It's very serious. People that, 15% of people that suffer a stroke will perish. 40 to 50% will have some form of a deficit. And so when we were considering our programs last year, I asked my science team to look at the psychedelic area, and were there any psychedelic programs that we could start that were a typical pharma play, where we're not making it, growing it, hiring psychiatrists or psychologists, opening up centers. That's a vertical integration model. What's the pharma model? Well, develop a compound, establish intellectual property, and take it through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and try to get approval. So here's what's interesting about DMT, N,N-dimethyltryptamine. It's in the same family as psilocybin and psilocin, magic mushrooms. It clears the body in about 8 minutes, so it's got a very short half-life. But more importantly, scientists over the last few years found that when you expose brain cells to DMT, they begin to grow. This neuronal growth is called neuroplasticity. And when you have a stroke, which shuts down the blood supply in your brain, you've got dead cells, and the brain begins to rewire. That's how you recover from a stroke. And some of the early data, what's known as in vitro, so cells, then in vivo animals, showed a very significant, meaning the p-value was high, over 0.05, that showed DMT, when exposed to brain cells, helped the brain cell begin to grow at a rate that, in fact, was confirmed as helping rats in a stroke model recover from their stroke. So they were able to, in this one study in Hungary, rats that were given a stroke, it was surgically created, cuts the blood flow off to the brain. They had a dramatically less area of dead cells, so DMT reduced the damage while the stroke was going on. And the vast majority, with statistical significance, had almost a full recovery from their motor function. So this was very significant, because this suggests that if you give people DMT while they're having a stroke in the acute phase, or once the stroke is done and they're trying to recover, the DMT may actually help reduce the damage and help them recover. So we announced that we were going to investigate DMT for stroke. We filed for new intellectual property Not an easy thing to do in the psychedelic drug space for those of you that are investors, because these are natural occurring substances and they are they're not novel. In other words, literature has been published, there's been discussions. So our strategy includes filing for new forms of DMT, new salt forms. Don't have time to go into it, but it's a new composition of matter, patents for dosing, formulation, and also method of use, combining DMT with rehabilitation. We are planning to conduct our clinical trials in the United Kingdom because they have experience. The FTA of the UK has welcomed these types of studies in the past, and we're moving to, we have applied for approval for our next study, which is a phase 1 study. And then we would hope to follow with that phase 1 study onto a phase 2 study, where we're actually treating patients that are in the middle of a stroke to see if our DMT will help. So just looking at our time, I'm going to talk about our 2 lead programs, and we'll see, because I'm in 15 minutes already. So
you're good for time, Chris. Go ahead.
Okay.
Very interesting.
So this is really, and Paul had mentioned, and I probably have to update where he got the info from. We did investigate ifenprotal for COVID-19. 2 years ago, we threw our hat in the ring. Ifenprotal, which is this ex-Sanofi drug from Japan. It's being used to treat vertigo in Japan. So limited market. It's only sold in Japan and South Korea. It's never been in the US or Europe. It showed that it may in fact help patients that could have had COVID. So we did run an international study. It ended up that it wasn't helping patients enough to move it forward. And while that was going on, of course, we've been looking at ifenprotal for a very serious lung disease called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. This is a disease of unknown origin. That's what idiopathic means. Pulmonary, lung fibrosis. Your lungs get very scarred and fibrotic. You cannot exchange oxygen. And so a very, very miserable disease. You've got on average 3 to 4 years to live once you're diagnosed. And our lead scientist in the early days looked at ifenprotal's activity, and he thought that it might be helpful in lung disease. And so we ran an animal study where we recreated lung disease in a mouse model. We gave the mice ifenprotal, and interestingly enough, it reduced fibrosis in the lungs by 50% and was much better in the animal than the 2 leading treatments for IPF. So this was encouraging. We went on to additionally do some animal research on chronic cough. And the mechanism of action is neuronal. So in the brain, we're not trying to stop the cough in the lung. We're trying to interrupt the connection in the brain. And so we are running a phase 2 trial in Australia, 20 patient open label, which means no placebo. We announced recently that we've completed enrollment, and we're hoping to have data in June, so Q2 of this year. And this is a phase 2A study. We're looking for markers that suggest IPF is working. So we'll be taking the blood of the patients that were in the study. They get treatment for 12 weeks. We're also treating their cough. So we have to have patients that not only have IPF, but also cough. And we're hoping, we actually have 2 clinical trials in one. And so, as an investor, we're rolling the dice twice. We hope to have IPF data, and we also have to have good cough data. If we have both, that would be even more fantastic. So that's some background on this. Is probably our most exciting, because if you think back to the earlier slide, phase 2 data is the greatest moment of value creation in a company like Algernon. So this is just a little more information about, I just want to touch on the fact that we did announce that we had some preliminary positive data for our cough part of that study in Australia. We didn't announce statistics. It was a descriptive format. We did communicate with the FDA, and we posed the question, if we have good data from Australia, can we move into a phase 2 study in the US for cough? and we announced positive feedback from them. Just quickly, we're also looking at investigating ifenprotal for 2 types of cancers, pancreatic and small lung cancer. I'm not going to drag you through the data. Ifenprotal is very active it's an NMDA receptor antagonist, specifically the sub-2B subunit. For those biochemists on the call, it just means that it attaches itself to a very specific area on cells. And that area is involved in fibrosis, it's involved in inflammation. So it's got this vast application, and based on the data, we're trying to figure out and have a win. Where would ifenprotal be best to be repurposed? So just quickly to touch on our new program that we announced, and keep in mind, our model is to have multiple programs. I just got off the phone with the US analyst this morning, and he was, this was refreshing to him, because most US companies our size have one drug and only one focus. And it's a new chemical entity, because repurposing hasn't really been done before the way Algernon's doing it. The fact is, we can have multiple programs going on at the same time. So just to wrap up, we are investigating an ex-Mitsubishi drug called Respirinast, sold only in Japan to treat asthma, came off the market in 2013. It's a very safe small molecule. And we did research to find out if it would help treating kidney disease, fibrosis. Fibrosis is part of inflammation. Without going into too much detail, Respirinast interferes with the expression of proteases from mast cells. That's how it treated asthma. But there's an involvement in mast cells and fibrosis in the kidney. So we actively pursued the investigation of Respirinast. We'd sort of been sitting on this data for a while because of bandwidth and resources. We've now announced that we want to move it forward, but the data was very compelling. When we ran an animal study and we create kidney disease in the animal and gave them Respirinast compared to control, it was highly effective in reducing the amount of scarring, 50% compared to control. And actually, that's a p-value. That means that the data is likely not an anomaly, that it is repeatable, and having a good p-value is important when you're doing your research. So just about to conclude, and we can get to some questions. Our milestones were, we have an approval application in with the UK FDA to start our phase 1 study for DMT and stroke. We're expecting data from our chronic cough study and IPF. We've already begun the manufacturing of our drug, Respirinast. We need that cGMP supply to run our study. These are all the phase 1 studies we're planning in Q4, ifenprotal pancreatic, ifenprotal small cell, Respirinast CKD. And if everything goes as planned, we hope to be running our phase 2 study for stroke and DMT in the UK in Q1 of next year. High level, we went through a reorganization back in the fall. It was something that is not easily done, and the decision wasn't made easily. The objective was to be able to uplist to the NASDAQ. And the NASDAQ doesn't consider 5-cent stock companies, but they do $4 plus companies. So we did reorganize the company. We have 1.68 million shares outstanding. Options and warrants were fully diluted at 2.1. And, you know, we had a pretty good January considering tax loss selling in December. We have a VWAP 30 days of about $6.80. And the stock, like everything else, is softened in the last little bit, but really with no volume. I can't speak too much about the details, except to say that we have obviously applied to uplist to the NASDAQ. We made our F1 registration a public document about 2 weeks ago, showing Ladenburg as our investment banker. And I'll try to do my best, but I can't really talk about financing at the moment or the NASDAQ process, except to say that we have to wait. And when we have news, we'll announce it to the market. We have limited time. Folks can go on and learn about the management team. I've brought together some very skilled and experienced executives to join me at the helm. We have a very experienced board of directors, and we also bring on board experts from around the world in all of our areas of study, whether it's IPF and cough or psychedelics or stroke and now CKD. And we've announced these luminaries that consult to Algernon and help us with guide our program. So that's an overview, and thank you. And I'll look forward to taking some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. That was extremely interesting. We have quite a few questions. Let's get started with John's. How do you get the information which determine which drugs you're going to pursue?
So it's a very good question. My chief science officer, who was a co-founder of Algernon, Dr. Mark Williams, now is on the board of directors. He likes to say that the way he does it is the old-fashioned way. He reads.
Yeah.
And so he studied probably 100 drugs. He read about their target, their mechanism. They had to fulfill certain specifications. They had to be a small molecule as opposed to a biologic, meaning it's synthesized. It had to have a limited market. It had to have a good safety history. Then he looked at its mechanism and target. And some of its magic special sauce, like the Kentucky Fried Chicken recipe, so he won't disclose. But what's important is it needs to be novel, because sometimes you rely on a method of use. There are a limited number of these compounds out there. We actually have 2 additional drugs from the Soviet Union. Not a great time to talk about that country and what's going on, but we have probably another 2 or 3 compounds sitting in. I like to use the analogy of the batter's box. If this is a baseball game, we can bring out a couple of more compounds even still, but we have a good pipeline. It's quite full. We don't want to overwhelm investors, but that hopefully answers your question a bit. The good old-fashioned way, and that's just deep research on drugs, how they work, what they do in the body.
So that brings me then to the next question. When you're repurposing an existing drug, do you have to reapply for FDA or Health Canada? What's that procedure?
Yes, you do. So actually you go to the FDA or Health Canada, or in the case of the Australia, where we went to run our study, you present the data that's historically available, because these drugs have been around a while. And you have to explain to them, you have to have good animal data. You just can't come to the FDA and say, hey, this drug's been treating arthritis for 50 years in Japan. We think it'll treat brain tumors, and they're not going to let you go and do it. You've got to show your animal data.
Okay.
You have to then confirm efficacy. You have to write a protocol. Then you go to them in a pre-IND application. This is a special process where you get to think about building a building in downtown Montreal. You have your architect do rough plans. You send it to the city center, and they have a quick look, and they say, hey, you can't build a 40-story high building on René Lévesque. Nothing bigger than the Basilica. So it needs to only be 2 stories. And they give you feedback. And then you, based on that information, you develop your plan. So yes, you have to start from scratch with approvals to get your studies going, but you don't have to go back to the very beginning and have all of your preclinical work done.
Okay, so now when we're talking about the trials, who does the trials for you, and how active are you with them?
Okay, so we are a virtual company. If I walked you around our office, we have a boardroom and 5 offices and busy executives. We hire contract research organizations. These are specialists that run clinical trials globally, or in the US or Canada or the UK. They're the experts. So they file, you have a budget from them. You say, I want to run a 100-patient study for stroke. And they'll tell you it's a 4 million study or 3 million. They run all the details. We manage them. But it's like having somebody hiring to build your home. They run it all. You're managing them, but we don't have boots on the ground. But we're very active with daily updates, weekly reports. It's very complex, highly regulated, and we're on it. It's a daily thing.
Yeah. So when you're, do you work with the existing pharma company that had the original drug, or is it more of a research, as you mentioned?
Excellent question. Now, think about, let's take ifenprodil. So it was approved for vertigo. It's in Japan. It's sold only in Japan. And so in the early days, to keep your costs down, sometimes you can do a deal and get the drug supply from the Japanese, and you can take it into another country to run your study, because it costs about $1 million to $2 million to start making the drug yourself.
Okay, that was my next
So
question.
to keep your costs low, it's wise economically to try to use an existing supply.
Okay.
Get it into a trial. If it works, now you can start making your own and new formulation. Maybe the current pill is 3 times a day. You want to do a once a day pill, or you want to do a patch or nasal delivery or intravenous. So you don't need to rely on the original. The patent is off, the composition of matter. You file new intellectual property, but the sooner you control manufacturing, the better.
Okay.
But we try to do it economically. Where we can, we use the current supplier. In the case of Respirinast for chronic kidney disease, Mitsubishi doesn't make it anymore. We can't get that drug anywhere in the world. So we've started manufacturing it, and the cost is at least $500,000 to get that drug made.
Okay. All right. That's great. So now competition. Who's your competition and how do you differ? Who's out there doing what you're doing?
So it's very tough to give a firm answer. Public companies report on their research. So let's just briefly talk disease by disease. Keep in mind that private research companies may not be sharing by news release or by presentation what they're working on. We believe we're going to be the first company in the world to test DMT for stroke. There was a company in Canada that announced that they were doing some research, but we are on the verge of approval for a phase 1 study. We believe we'll be the first to test DMT for stroke, and therefore would be the first to get it into the clinic. For chronic cough, our competition is clearly Bellus Health and also Merck and their drug gefapixant. And Bellus is, I believe, in the process of a phase 3, or they have started that process. Gefapixant has done their phase 3. They were delayed for approval. I can say that when we did our research in our animal study, we went against the Merck drug, and we outperformed it in the animal study. Now, does that mean it will be outperforming in a human study? We don't know. We'll have to go. We'll have our own data. But the data was compelling. In the chronic kidney disease, there are a lot of drugs that are in phase 2 for chronic kidney disease. But the current treatment is to keep your blood pressure down. The lower the blood pressure, it's less hard on your kidneys. And there are a number of different modalities. So this would be the first time this mechanism of action, a protease inhibitor, could work in fibrosis. But there are lots of companies in phase 2, but there hasn't been a new treatment for 25 or 30 years.
Wow.
The solid cancers, there's lots going on, but solid cancers is a very tough area. So we're not first there and best dressed, but the competition is thin.
Okay, great. Paul, I see you joined us. You have 1 or 2 questions?
I have a couple, yeah. You only have, what you say, 1.5 million shares outstanding. Who are the shareholders?
Our largest shareholder is Alpha North Investment Management in Canada. And in fact, they're obviously not at 10% because they would be filing. But they did announce in January that they tripled their position. And then the average shares would probably sort of be in the 50 to 100,000 range. So the stock is very widely held. This, I believe, came from our work in COVID-19. For those of you who followed the stock and may have invested, we went from 6 cents to 60 cents. From March of 2020 to August of 2021, aggregating CSE and OTCQB, we traded over 1 billion shares. So very widely traded. The stock, other than Alpha North, is widely held.
Okay, going back to something you said earlier, drugs are patented. How long does a patent last? Are they perpetual?
A patent is 20 years.
So anything after 20 years, it's free territory, basically, to you people?
Right. So what happens, just to explain it, if you invent or discover a new drug, you file a composition of matter.
Okay.
You own it for 20 years. Nobody can touch it, talk about it, look at it. That pharma company owns it. After the 20 years, it becomes generic. So anybody can make it. But then there are different patents you can file that will help you protect market exclusivity, including a method of use patent that says that drug treats that disease and only we can treat it. Then you have dosing, formulation. You also have orphan indication, meaning some drugs, the disease is small but important. The FDA will protect you for 8 years.
Oh.
And IPF is an orphan indication, so are the cancers we're working on. That means if you're there first for approval, no one can touch you for 8 years. And if you think about my first chart, if a patent lasts 20 years and it takes about 13 for a new drug to get through, a pharma only has about 7 years to sell their drug and make hay before it gets generic. So an 8-year protection for orphan is very important.
So you mentioned earlier that one drug that you couldn't get anymore, you're manufacturing it.
Yes.
Would you, if you're successful with any of your projects, would you manufacture the new drug? And how would you distribute it?
Well, so I've been very upfront with the market that when we started Algernon, I never envisioned us becoming a full-fledged pharma. Although I can tell you, we've taken the mystery out of it. You can run a phase 3 trial. You don't have to be Roche or Bayer. You've got more intellectual capacity behind you and skill and experience, but you can hire that. Our model has been to achieve good phase 2 data on any one of our drugs and look at creating significant value and then looking to partner or license. And so if we had to, we could go through, but when you say to me, and I don't want to be facetious, but when you say, how would we do it? Once we have our cGMP supply, and if we had FDA approval, we would put an order in with the manufacturer to produce 32 million pills and send it into the US, and you'd have a sales team selling to pharma, hospital. This isn't the mysterious world people think it is. It's important because it's our health and it's complicated, but it's a real basic, it's highly regulated, but you have manufacturing, distribution, and consumption. It's very straightforward.
Okay, a couple of financial questions here. How do you stand, like cash on hand, and do you have any debt?
We have no debt. As of our last Q1, we reported in excess of 2 million cash in the bank.
Oh, excellent.
Our G&A burns at about 130,000 a month. And we break out our clinical trials per program. So that gives you an idea. We're not, I'm not being leveraged for cash. I didn't roll back the stock because I was in a desperate mode to finance. Sometimes if you're on the TSXV, you're at 3 cents, you roll it up to 10 cents. So you're north of 5 cents. It was to qualify for a NASDAQ uplist, have access to the US NASDAQ market. I was misquoted a while ago that I think Canadians aren't that knowledgeable about biotech compared to NASDAQ, and that's not what I meant or said. It's just a bigger market. And
naturally.
Algernon has a chance at being properly valuated. As an example, there is a phase 2 company on the NASDAQ who have some early stroke data. They have $100 million market cap. We will be in a phase 2 within the next 10 or 12 months. So think about that. We're at 10 million today, just on one program. So I think NASDAQ could be very important to get the right eyes on our stock, where analysts start to cover it, funds can start to buy us. We're not a 5 cent stock, we're a $5 stock. And that was the idea of NASDAQ.
So Chris, do you plan then on, with this potential NASDAQ listing coming up, to start marketing more aggressively in the US?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. We've lined up people who are, because funds can now buy us. So we've got people that have deep Rolodex funds, contacts, road shows. We can now start to market to a group that really have never heard about us. They have no idea. We're on the CSE. They don't really buy CSE stocks, or they can't. So I think it'll bring us into a new, it's like running a horse race in Yorkton compared to the racetrack in Toronto. You're going up in company in terms of your depth of investors and their experience with what a biotech is.
Now, I know you mentioned that you can't really talk about it, but if you were looking at, Q2, Q3, Q4, what would be your goal to be listed on the NASDAQ?
Yesterday. And, we did announce that in our public document that there was, because you file an F1 registration, I disclosed a financing as part of that NASDAQ uplist. Part of the qualifications, you need to have a certain transactional share price. You need to have a certain shareholders equity, which we qualify for. You need to have a certain number of board lots, and the investment underwriting of your U.S. investment banker, which we've been working with for many, many months. We've done a lot of work, due diligence. Really, you're basically inviting a third party to come in and go through all your data, all your documentation. And, we do take pride. I'm often criticized that our news releases can be a little too technical, and but veracity is important to us. We're trying to, and we want to be viewed from day one as a big pharma potential partner or a licensed target. And that's how I've tried to run the company. So to answer your question, not to be skirting it, it can take upwards of 6 months. We've applied in October, and you go through a process. We had the Christmas delay and so on. And capital markets are reeling from what's going on in Europe with these poor folks in the Ukraine and how it's going to impact on the market. We hope there are no delays, but that gives you some timing.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
One final question. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that you did some work with psychedelics. Are
Yes.
you looking at any companies that are involved in research with CBD, CBG, CBNs, or THC?
We are not. We're not expanding our psychedelic, and in essence, because we are delivering or wanting to deliver a sub-psychedelic dose to patients, we're really not even a psychedelic company. Although I'm talking psychedelic so we get people's attention, but really I think it's intuitive. If you've had a stroke, you've had an injury, you're in a state of confusion. To go on a journey where you're seeing colors and aliens and the almighty, well, that's really, in fact, a lot of stroke drugs have failed because patients were jumping out of bed. Now, a lot of drugs we take are hallucinogenic. If you're on sleeping pills, if you take a few of them, you might be seeing things. So it's not this fear of the psychedelics. This was all brought on by this 1960s trying to shut down. Lots of drugs have hallucinogenic or psychoactive elements. So we're not looking at expanding our psychedelic space. In essence, again, this is really a pure pharma play. Control a drug, manufacture it, have intellectual property, get good phase 2 data, and see if we can get interest of a big pharma partner.
All right, perfect. Chris, thanks very much for today. Much appreciated. You've got a great story unfolding. This is a time frame company, it's everything is timed, like the trials. So you have to go through the process. We'll continue to follow you, put out all your press releases, and keep everybody up to speed on what's going on with Algernon.
Great.
I hope you can come back once you list on the NASDAQ. That'd be wonderful.
Okay, you've got
there you go.
A date. Okay, thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks very much. Take care, everyone.